What happens when two corrupt police officers frame an innocent man? This is the gripping story of a determined black man who, after witnessing years of injustice against his brother, takes matters into his own hands. From a high-stakes traffic stop to the intense fallout that follows, watch as he exposes the corrupt officers and serves them a taste of the justice they thought they could escape. The warm afternoon sun stretched lazily across the quiet suburban road, casting long shadows that seemed to reach far into the horizon. As Jason Taylor cruised down the smooth pavement of the street in his car, he could only hear the faint hum of the engine, the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. It was one of those rare moments of calm, the kind that seemed to last forever, until the flashing red and blue lights suddenly erupted in his rearview mirror. Jason's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as his heart rate spiked. He could feel the pulse of adrenaline surge through him, but his face remained calm, controlled. This wasn't the first time he had been pulled over by an officer. It was, however, the first time he had ever been this prepared. He knew what was coming next. Taking a deep breath, Jason slowly rolled the car to the side of the road, positioning it just off the shoulder. His gaze flickered to the side mirror, catching a glimpse of the police cruiser stopping right behind him. His mind raced, recalling the events that had led to this moment. This exact moment when the system had failed his brother, Malcolm. Jason had been planning for this day for months. Every detail had been meticulously prepared. His car, an unassuming sedan, was rigged with hidden cameras and audio equipment. Every angle had been covered. The dashboard cameras would capture every move, every word. Jason wasn't just about to fight for his own freedom. He was about to expose the officers who had wrongfully put his brother Malcolm behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. The police officer who stepped out of the cruiser was Officer Ryan Blake. He walked toward Jason's car with the kind of swagger that spoke to years of unchecked power. His partner, Officer Brad Turner, followed behind him, less certain in his stride, but complicit nonetheless. Blake was the kind of officer who had spent his career skirting the line between authority and corruption, always pushing, always bending the rules to suit his needs. Turner, on the other hand, was the type who followed orders, even when he knew they were wrong. Jason's heart remained steady, his breath controlled. His hands remained at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. He wasn't about to let Blake or Turner see him nervous. This was his chance to turn the tables, to fight back against the injustice that had been dealt to his brother. Blake reached the driver's side window, his face already twisted into a mock smile, his sunglasses reflecting Jason's face back at him. "Afternoon," Blake said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Afternoon, officer," Jason replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. He kept his hands where Blake could see them, doing everything by the book to avoid giving Blake any reason to escalate the situation. Blake leaned in, his expression predatory. "You know why I stopped you?" he asked, his voice sharp, as if he was expecting Jason to cower. Jason met his gaze, unwavering. "No, officer. Care to explain?" Blake smirked. "Your taillight's out. You've been swerving a bit too, maybe a little too fast for the road. Where are you headed?" Jason looked at the rearview mirror briefly, catching the nervous glance from Turner, who was still standing near the passenger side door. He let the silence linger for a moment before replying. "Just heading home. Didn't notice anything wrong with the taillight." Blake chuckled, without humor. "We'll see about that." His voice was filled with that infuriating self-assurance. "License and registration, please." Jason reached for his wallet, pulling out the documents in a deliberate, controlled manner. The stage was set now. The officers had no idea they were already digging their own graves, exposing themselves with every word, every action. Jason handed the paperwork to Blake, who looked it over with a small, victorious grin. "Broken tail light and erratic driving? You've got yourself a real problem, pal," Blake said, his voice dripping with contempt. Jason kept his hand steady on the wheel. "With all due respect, officer, the tail light worked fine when I left home. Maybe it's just a mistake." Blake's smile widened. "Yeah, sure," he said mockingly. He barked a laugh, and Turner chuckled faintly from behind him. Jason remained silent, keeping his eyes focused on the officers. Every insult, every small step they took toward escalating the situation was being recorded. Everything. Damon wasn't going to let them get away with this again, not after what they had done to Malcolm. Blake looked back at Turner, who was still inspecting the car. "Step out of the car," Blake ordered suddenly, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Jason hesitated for just a second, not because he was afraid, but because he needed to make sure they didn't have a reason to escalate the situation further. "Is there a reason for this, officer?" "I've complied with everything so far." Blake's face twisted into something even darker. "You're gonna step out now or we'll make it worse for you," he said, his hand hovering near his gun in a not-so-subtle threat. Jason remained calm, glancing at the reflection in the mirror one more time. He could see Blake's smug face and Turner standing off to the side, arms crossed and waiting for Jason to comply. Slowly, deliberately, Jason unclipped his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out with calculated care. The afternoon sun hit him full on as he straightened, his hands clearly at his sides. Blake sneered. "Good boy," he muttered under his breath. "Let's keep this simple. Hands on the hood of the car." Jason walked to the front of the car, placing his hands flat against the hot metal of the hood. He could feel the heat seeping through his clothes, but it didn't faze him. As Blake circled him like a vulture, Jason's eyes flickered toward Turner, who was now rifling through the glove compartment. Turner wasn't even trying to be discreet, tossing papers aside carelessly, as if he had all the time in the world. "What's this?" Turner called out, pulling something out from underneath the passenger seat. Jason's heart skipped a beat, but his face remained a mask of calm. Turner held up a small bag of what looked like drugs. "Aha, what do we have here?" he said triumphantly. Blake's eyes lit up, his grin widening. Well, well, well. Look what we found," he sneered, holding the bag up to Jason's face. "Care to explain this?" Jason kept his expression unreadable. "I don't know what that is." Blake laughed, shaking the bag in front of him. "Yeah, sure you don't." He tossed the bag to Turner. "Run it through the system. Let's see what else we find on this guy." Jason didn't flinch. His eyes flickered toward Turner, who was already moving toward the cruiser to check the bag. Every second was a moment closer to the end of their reign of terror. Jason stood still, his breath steady, as Blake circled him like a predator. The sun beat down on the back of his neck, the hot pavement beneath his shoes feeling like it was closing in on him. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, the quiet hum of traffic in the distance serving as the only sound. The officers were getting more agitated by the second, unaware that every word, every move, was being recorded by the hidden cameras in his car. Blake's boots scraped against the gravel as he closed the gap between them. "You know, I don't like people who think they're too good for the law," he muttered, his voice low and full of venom. "You think you're smarter than us, don't you?" Jason remained silent, letting the tension hang in the air. He wasn't about to give Blake the satisfaction of a response. The more Blake tried to provoke him, the more the officer was digging his own grave. Every word, every insult, was another piece of evidence that would be used to expose him, and Jason was patient. He knew this was all part of the plan. "Don't play games with me, man," Blake growled, stepping closer. He shoved Jason slightly, pushing him harder into the hood of the car. The heat from the metal seared through Jason's shirt, but he didn't react. Instead, he let out a slow exhale, his body taut, but under control. "I asked you a question." Jason's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. He had learned long ago not to let people like Blake rattle him. In situations like this, silence was power. Blake's hand twitched, and Jason knew the officer was itching to escalate things further. He could feel the weight of the moment hanging over them. This was it. Either the officers would back down, or they would do something they would regret. But Jason was ready. He had prepared for this. Meanwhile, Turner was back at the cruiser, his head down as he fiddled with the radio. Jason could hear the faint sound of buttons being pressed, followed by the soft crackle of static. Then Turner's voice cut through the air, sharper than it had been before. "Blake, there's nothing on him. I ran the system. No warrants, no priors, no nothing." Blake's face twisted into an expression of frustration. "What do you mean there's nothing on him?" "Keep looking," he spat. His eyes flicked back to Jason, narrowing. "You think you're untouchable because you've got a clean record? You think you can just get away with everything?" Jason's gaze shifted briefly toward the passing cars, then returned to Blake. "I didn't break any laws, officer, but you might want to check your own record." Blake's face flushed with anger. He stepped closer, his fists clenched, but Jason remained perfectly still. He wasn't intimidated. "You've got one hell of a mouth on you, don't you?" Blake sneered. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh? You think you can just talk your way out of this?" Jason met Blake's glare with a quiet intensity, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not here to be your hero, officer. I'm here to make sure you don't ruin my life like you did to my brother." The words hung in the air for a moment. Blake's lips curled into a smug smile, but there was something else in his eyes now, something darker. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against Jason's skin. "You think you've got us figured out, don't you? Well, we're the system, pal, and we decide what happens out here." His hand brushed against his gun, not pulling it out, but the threat was clear. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, but his face was a mask of calm. He could feel the weight of the cameras in his car, the pressure of the moment building, but he didn't flinch. He had prepared for this, and now it was time to let Blake dig his own grave. Every second was a step closer to the truth being revealed. "Get back in the car," Blake barked, pulling Jason away from the hood with a harsh shove. Jason stumbled slightly, but his body remained steady, his hands held up in plain sight, showing no sign of resistance. Turner stepped toward him, holding out a pair of cuffs with a mocking grin on his face. Jason's mind raced. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Blake and Turner had no idea that the footage was already being uploaded to his contact, the man who would make sure the world saw what they were doing. Every second was another nail in their coffin. "Turner, go ahead and cuff him," Blake ordered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let's get this over with." Turner moved closer, his eyes flicking nervously between Jason and Blake. He hesitated for just a moment, but then he snapped the cuffs around Jason's wrists, pulling them tight. Jason didn't flinch. He didn't resist. "Let's go," Turner said, his voice quieter now, as if unsure of what was happening. Blake grinned, sensing victory. "You should have just played along, kid," he said as he pushed Jason toward the cruiser. "This would have been easy if you hadn't tried to act smart." Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew what was coming next. The moment he was in the cruiser, the truth would be on its way to the world, and nothing Blake or Turner could do would stop it now. As Jason slid into the back of the police cruiser, the cold metal biting into his skin, he allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The officers still didn't realize that they had just sealed their own fate. Blake slammed the door shut behind him, his footsteps echoing as he walked around to the front of the cruiser. Jason glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Blake's smug face in the reflection. But Jason knew that face would soon be gone, replaced by the truth. The engine of the police cruiser hummed as it pulled away from the roadside, the sound of the tires rolling over the pavement drowning out everything else. Jason leaned back against the hard seat, the cuffs digging into his wrists as he sat in the back of the car. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but his resolve remained unbroken. His heart beat steadily, each pulse reinforcing the quiet fire that burned within him. He could still hear Blake and Turner talking outside the car, their voices muffled but unmistakably tinged with arrogance. They had no idea what was about to happen. Jason's phone, carefully hidden in the folds of his jacket, was already transmitting the footage to his friend, a tech-savvy contact who had been helping him gather evidence for months. The footage was secure and ready to be shared with the world. All he had to do now was wait. As the cruiser cruised through the streets, Jason's mind drifted back to the day everything had changed. 2 years ago, when his brother Malcolm was wrongfully arrested by the same officers. Malcolm had been sentenced to prison for a crime he didn't commit, the victim of a setup by Blake and Turner. The pain of that moment, the helplessness of watching his brother's life spiral out of control, still haunted Jason. But now, in this car, he was doing everything he could to right those wrongs. Jason's fist clenched at the memory of his brother sitting in that courtroom, shackled and silent while Blake had smirked from the witness stand. The lies had spilled effortlessly from Blake's lips, each word more damaging than the last. Jason could still hear the judge's gavel fall, the finality of it hitting him like a punch to the gut. Malcolm had screamed his innocence until his voice broke, but no one had listened. Blake and Turner had walked away that day, their hands clean, their careers intact. "Clean work," they had said to each other as they laughed in the parking lot. Those two words had echoed in Jason's mind ever since. But now here he was. The tables had turned. This time it wasn't going to be swept under the rug. The cruiser turned a corner, its tires screeching slightly on the curve. Jason glanced out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by. The lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers across the pavement. The city had always felt so full of life, but today it felt different. Today, everything was changing. Jason glanced at the rearview mirror. He could see Blake's reflection as he drove, his face a mask of false confidence. Jason allowed himself a small smile. The officers still didn't know that their empire of corruption was about to crumble. As they neared the station, the tension in the car grew palpable. Jason could feel it in the way the officers' voices became quieter, their words edged with a thin veneer of frustration. They had expected this to be an easy stop. They had expected Jason to fold, to back down, but he hadn't, and now they were scrambling. The cruiser slowed as it approached the station, and Jason could see the large gray building looming ahead. The police station, a place of authority, had always felt like a fortress, imposing, unyielding. But today, Jason was about to show them just how fragile their walls really were. Blake parked the car with a sharp jerk and got out without a word. Turner followed him, looking less certain, more hesitant. Jason stayed still, his eyes scanning the parking lot. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, their hum a sharp contrast to the rising tension in the air. As Blake and Turner opened the back door, Jason didn't move. He didn't flinch when Blake's rough hand grabbed his arm and yanked him out of the car. He didn't resist when they marched him toward the entrance of the station. Every step was another step toward justice, and he wasn't about to let them break him now. The doors to the station swung open with a loud clang, and Jason was pushed inside. The sterile air hit him as he crossed the threshold. The familiar smell of coffee and old paper mixed with the faint scent of sweat and metal. It was the same station that had failed his brother. But this time, it wasn't going to be so easy for them. Blake led him down a narrow hallway, the sound of their boots echoing off the tile floors. Jason's eyes remained forward, his face blank, but inside he was calculating. Every move the officers made, every word they said, was being recorded. His phone was sending the footage to his contact in real time. Jason knew that once it hit the internet, the world would see the truth, and there was nothing Blake or Turner could do to stop it. They stopped in front of a small, dingy holding cell. Blake turned to Jason with a sickening smile. "You're not going to be laughing when this is all over," he sneered. "You're going to rot in here while we do our job." Jason's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. He knew exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to break him, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Not now, not ever. Blake shoved him into the cell, the door slamming shut behind him with a metallic clang. Jason stood there for a moment, the cold concrete floor beneath his feet grounding him. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As he settled onto the hard bench, he allowed himself a brief moment of peace. The footage was already out there. The world was watching, and soon Blake and Turner would pay for their crimes. Jason sat in the holding cell, his body tense but his mind calm. The cold metal bench pressed into his back, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead buzzing softly. He wasn't focused on the discomfort. He wasn't focused on the hours that could pass before he'd be processed. He was focused on one thing, the truth. It was out there now. His cameras, his careful planning, everything he had done in the last few months. It was all coming together. Outside the cell, Jason could hear the muffled sounds of voices, the clatter of footsteps, and the occasional murmur of conversation. Blake and Turner were probably celebrating their victory, but they had no idea how badly they had just dug their own graves. They were so sure they had control. They had no idea what was about to happen to them. The hum of distant chatter became more distinct, and Jason's ears picked up snippets of conversation. He strained to hear, his instincts honed by years of quiet observation. Two officers stood near the desk, their voices hushed, but their words were clear enough for Jason to catch. "I can't believe he was so calm about it," one of the officers muttered. "I thought we had him cornered, but he barely flinched. This guy's got something up his sleeve." The other officer, a young man, seemed less confident. "You don't think? He couldn't have had the foresight to record everything, could he?" Jason's heart skipped a beat. He knew Blake had no idea about the cameras, but to hear them talking about it, it meant they were already starting to question their power. Their confidence was beginning to crack. "Doesn't matter," Blake's voice interrupted. "We'll lock him up, make the evidence stick, and nothing's going to change. He's just another guy who thinks he can outsmart us." Jason's mind whirred. He was right about the officer's arrogance, but they hadn't realized the gravity of what was happening. Blake thought he had everything under control, but this wasn't just about Jason anymore. This was bigger than that. Jason had a plan. He wasn't just going to sit in this cell and let it all happen. He was going to make sure the officers felt every ounce of their own betrayal. A few moments later, Blake and Turner entered the holding area, their footsteps heavy, their faces set in expressions of grim satisfaction. Blake's hand gripped his radio as if it were the last shred of authority he had. When they reached the cell, Blake looked down at Jason, his eyes cold but simmering with annoyance. "Well, well," Blake sneered. "Look who's still got a mouth. You thought you could play us, huh? Thought you could make us look bad? Well, it's too late now, pal. We're taking you down, and nothing's going to change that." Jason stood up slowly, his hands still cuffed, his posture unbroken. "You're wrong, Blake. You've already lost," he said, his voice calm, carrying a weight that surprised even him. He could see Blake's sneer falter for just a second, just enough to notice the unease that was beginning to creep into the officer's features. Blake tried to hide it, but Jason could see it. "You think you've won?" Blake barked, stepping forward with a threatening motion. "You haven't won anything yet, kid. You're nothing but a criminal, a liar, and your little stunt with the cameras? That's not going to change the outcome. We've got everything in our hands. We control the narrative." Jason's gaze didn't waver. "That's the problem with people like you, Blake. You think you control everything, but you're wrong. You've been wrong this whole time. You've been using your badge to cover up your lies, your corruption. But that's over now. You just don't know it yet." Blake was silent for a moment, the anger on his face fading into something else, something almost like realization. His lips curled into a twisted smile as he turned to Turner. "This kid thinks he's a hero, huh? Well, let's see how heroic he is when he's facing a judge and a jury." Turner, still hesitant, spoke up. "Blake, you really think it's that simple? We've been doing this for years. This guy's got to be the one who's prepared. What if—" Blake shot Turner a sharp look. "Shut it, Turner. We've got this handled." His voice was low and dangerous. Jason's gaze flicked briefly to Turner, then back to Blake. He knew Turner wasn't entirely on board with this, and he could see the crack in his partner's confidence. It wasn't enough to sway Turner yet, but Jason could sense that the officer wasn't completely convinced that everything was going according to plan, and that was an opening. Blake's voice returned to its mocking tone as he stepped back toward the door. "Well, have fun rotting in here, pal. When this is all over, you'll be begging for a deal." Jason's fingers curled slightly around the cold bars of the cell as Blake and Turner walked away. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. They had underestimated him. But Jason knew the hard part was still to come. The footage had already been uploaded to his friend's secure server, but it hadn't been made public yet. Timing was everything. The hours dragged by, the weight of the cuffs biting into his skin, the stillness of the cell pressing against him. But Jason remained calm. He had prepared for this. He knew what needed to be done. And soon the world would see Blake and Turner for what they were: corrupt, dishonest, and dangerous. After what felt like an eternity, Jason was led out of the holding cell and into a small, windowless room for questioning. Blake and Turner sat across from him, their faces tight with frustration. Jason kept his gaze steady, knowing that the moment he'd been waiting for was coming. It was time to reveal the truth. Blake slammed a file onto the table. "Let's get this over with, kid. You think you can pull some slick lawyer tricks and get out of here? Think again. You're not walking out of here clean. You're not walking out of here at all." Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he pressed a button hidden in his sleeve. He knew it would send a signal to his contact. Within moments, the door to the room burst open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. Jason's lawyer, Mark Lawson, walked in, his face grim but his demeanor calm. "Enough of this," Mark said, his voice steady as he approached the table. "You've already crossed the line, Officer Blake. And now the world will see it. Blake froze. His eyes flicked to Turner, who looked more nervous than Jason had ever seen him. Blake tried to recover, but the cracks in his facade were evident. Jason knew the fight was over. The weight of the room shifted the moment Mark Lawson walked in. The tension that had been suffocating Jason just moments before seemed to dissolve, replaced by something else: power, control, and the knowledge that this time, the truth was going to win. Blake's smugness faltered as he glanced at his partner, Turner, who seemed unsure of what to do next. The two officers were used to being in control, used to having the upper hand, but now they were on the defensive, and Jason could feel their world crumbling around them. Mark Lawson, Jason's lawyer, had been ready for this moment. He didn't say anything as he sat down at the table across from Blake and Turner. His eyes met Jason's for a brief moment, a silent understanding passing between them. It was the same understanding that Jason had felt from the very beginning. The plan had worked, and now it was time to reveal the truth. Blake scowled, trying to regain his composure. "What's this supposed to be, huh?" he sneered. "Some kind of trick? You think you can walk in here and make demands now that you've got a lawyer?" Mark's gaze remained steady. "You've been running a scam for years, Officer Blake. The only thing that's happening now is the world is about to find out what you and your partner have been doing." Jason kept his gaze fixed on Blake, his body still, his hands resting loosely in his lap. The truth was out, and there was no way to hide it now. The footage, the audio, the evidence, it was all there. Everything that Blake and Turner had done was about to be laid bare for the world to see. Jason had known this day would come. He'd been waiting for it. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His jaw clenched as he glared at Mark and Jason, but the bravado that had once defined him was slipping away. "This doesn't change anything," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "We'll cover it up. We'll make sure nobody believes you." Mark didn't flinch. "It's already too late for that," he said, calmly sliding a tablet across the table. On the screen, a news report began to play. The footage from Jason's car, the confrontation with Blake and Turner, was now live, streaming across the internet for everyone to see. The faces of Blake and Turner filled the screen, their arrogance and malice captured in high-definition clarity. Blake's face drained of color as he stared at the footage. "No," he muttered, as if hoping the video would somehow disappear. Jason's eyes were fixed on the screen. He could see the moment when Blake had leaned in too close, his hand hovering near his weapon. He could hear the smugness in Blake's voice as he tried to provoke him. Every word, every action was now part of the world's narrative. There was no denying it. They were exposed. The footage didn't stop there. It continued to show the officers rifling through the car, planting the small bag of drugs, and threatening Jason with violence. Everything was being documented, and Jason knew that the fallout from this video would be far-reaching. Mark tapped the screen with his finger, bringing up a series of still images. They were screenshots from the video. Images of Blake's smirk, Turner's hesitant glance, and the exact moment when the drugs were planted. "These images," Mark said, "will be part of an official investigation, and they're already circulating across every major news platform. You can't erase this. The world has seen it." Blake's breathing grew heavier as he leaned back in his chair, trying to regain his composure. But Jason could see the cracks. The cocky attitude was gone. Blake was no longer the one in control. "You don't understand," Blake said through clenched teeth. "We've been doing this for years. Do you think one video is going to bring us down? You've just exposed yourself as a fool." Jason leaned forward slightly, his voice low but filled with a quiet certainty. "You've been doing this for years, Blake. That's the problem. And now everyone knows what you've been hiding. You thought you could get away with it, but you can't anymore." Mark turned to Blake, his tone cold and professional. "This is just the beginning. Internal Affairs is already reviewing the footage, and it's being sent to every news outlet. Your actions have put the department under a microscope, and you can bet your badge that this will not end well for you." Blake shot a glance at Turner, who was still sitting silently beside him. The younger officer seemed increasingly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Blake and the tablet on the table. He had been complicit, but it was clear that the weight of the evidence was starting to weigh on him. "Turner, what do you think of this?" Mark asked, his voice cutting through the tension. "You've been involved in these actions. Do you think you can still cover it up?" Turner flinched, the guilt in his eyes visible to anyone who cared to look. I was just following orders," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know it would go this far." Jason's eyes locked onto Turner's, his expression unreadable. "It's too late to hide behind following orders, Turner. You were complicit in every part of this, and now you'll have to answer for it." Turner looked at Blake, his face pale as he seemed to reconsider his position. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth was sinking in for him, just as it had for Blake. There was no way out now. Jason could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway, signaling that the next phase of this process was about to begin. The pressure on Blake and Turner was mounting, and Jason could sense it. They were done. At that moment, the door to the room opened, and two investigators from Internal Affairs walked in. They were both dressed in plain suits, their expressions grim as they assessed the situation. One of them, a woman with short, dark hair, walked over to the table and glanced at the tablet. Her eyes flicked to Jason, then to Mark, and finally to Blake and Turner. "Officers Blake and Turner," she began, her voice steady but filled with authority. "You are both under investigation for misconduct, planting false evidence, and violating a suspect's rights. You've been caught on video. There's no denying it." Blake's face twisted in fury. "This isn't over," he growled. "You think you can just take us down like this?" The investigator didn't respond. Instead, she nodded to her partner, and the two officers moved to arrest Blake and Turner, their faces set in stone as they began to cuff them. Jason stood silently as the officers were led away, the sense of vindication growing with every step. It wasn't over yet, but today had been a victory. The fight for justice had just begun, and Blake and Turner would finally face the consequences of their actions. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Jason had gone from the back seat of a police cruiser to being the central figure in a fight for justice. The footage of Blake and Turner's abuse of power had spread like wildfire. News outlets had picked it up, social media was ablaze with outrage, and people all over the city were demanding accountability for the corrupt officers. But despite the public outcry, Jason knew the real battle was about to begin. The courtroom. The prosecution had gathered all the evidence they needed. The footage was undeniable. Jason's statement, the corroborating witnesses, and the damning testimonies from Internal Affairs and other victims, they were all working in his favor. But even with all the support, Jason knew this wouldn't be easy. Blake and Turner weren't going to go down without a fight. The morning of the trial arrived, and the atmosphere in the courthouse was tense. The halls were filled with reporters, family members, and members of the community who had been following the case. Jason could feel the weight of their gazes as he walked down the hall toward the courtroom. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was for Malcolm. This was for everyone who had been wronged by the system. As Jason entered the courtroom, he could feel the energy shift. The courtroom was packed, every seat was filled, and there was a heavy sense of anticipation hanging in the air. The judge, a stern woman with a no-nonsense attitude, called the room to order, and everyone rose to their feet. The defense was ready, and Blake and Turner were seated at the defense table, their faces tight with a mix of arrogance and fear. Their attorney, a slick, experienced lawyer, was already speaking to them in hushed tones, preparing them for what was to come. Jason didn't look at them. He had no need to. The truth was already out there, and it was going to be their undoing. As the judge called the case, the prosecution team stood. The district attorney, a woman named Sarah Collins, stepped forward. She was calm, collected, and ready to lay out the case. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, but he was ready. This was the moment he had been preparing for. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Sarah began, her voice strong and clear. "Today we are here to seek justice for Mr. Jason Taylor, who was unlawfully detained, threatened, and framed by two officers of the law, Officers Blake and Turner. We will show you the evidence, the video, the testimonies, and the undeniable truth of what these officers have done to an innocent man." Jason's gaze flickered to Blake and Turner, who were now seated at the table, their posture stiff, their faces trying to maintain composure. He could see the cracks in their confidence. The video had already done the hard work, but now it was time to make sure their lies couldn't stand. Sarah continued, her tone unwavering. We will prove that these officers, sworn to protect and serve, have betrayed their oaths, planting evidence and attempting to destroy an innocent man's life. They use their badge as a tool to manipulate the system for their own gain, but we won't let them get away with it. Jason sat up a little straighter in his chair, his eyes fixed on the district attorney. Her words were the validation he needed. She was speaking for everyone who had suffered at the hands of men like Blake and Turner. Jason wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone who had been wronged by those who were supposed to protect them. The defense attorney stood up next, his posture smooth and practiced, his eyes scanning the courtroom. He was a man used to working the system, used to bending the truth, but Jason wasn't worried. He knew the defense would try to twist things. He was ready for it. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense attorney began, his voice slick and charming. What you've seen here is a carefully orchestrated attempt to frame two dedicated officers. Officer Blake and Officer Turner have been in law enforcement for years, and they've always acted with integrity. This footage? Well, we all know how easily things can be manipulated, don't we? Jason clenched his fists under the table, the anger rising in his chest, but he kept his focus. He had prepared for this. He knew the defense would try to play on the jury's sympathy for the officers, trying to paint them as misunderstood. We'll show that Officer Blake and Officer Turner had every right to detain Mr. Taylor. They had reason to suspect criminal activity. And, as we'll prove, the evidence found in his car wasn't planted, it was real. Mr. Taylor's version of events is nothing more than an attempt to slander two men who have served this community with honor. Jason's stomach twisted at the lies spilling from the defense attorney's mouth, but he didn't let it show. The jury had to see the truth. They had to understand what these men had done. After the defense finished their statement, it was time for Jason to take the stand. His heart was pounding as he rose from his seat, the weight of the room's attention on him. He walked to the witness stand, his movements steady, his gaze locked forward. As he sat down, he could feel the eyes of the jury on him, waiting for his testimony. The moment had arrived. Sarah Collins began her questioning, her voice soft but firm. Mr. Taylor, can you tell us what happened the day you were detained by Officers Blake and Turner? Jason took a deep breath and began. I was driving home that afternoon when I was pulled over by Officers Blake and Turner. They told me my tail light was broken and that I was swerving. They didn't have a reason to pull me over. I knew that, but they didn't care. Jason recounted the events of that afternoon, the tension in his voice rising as he spoke about being ordered out of the car, being searched without cause, and the moment when Blake had planted the bag of drugs in his vehicle. He didn't hold back. He told the jury everything, how Blake had taunted him, how Turner had stood by, complicit in everything. I wasn't just pulled over, I was framed. They planted evidence in my car and tried to make it look like I was guilty of something I didn't do. I didn't fight back because I knew I had to stay calm, but I was recording the entire time, and now everyone can see the truth. The room was silent as Jason finished his testimony. The jury was still, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Jason could feel the weight of their judgment, but he didn't falter. This was the moment he had prepared for, the moment when his brother's name would finally be cleared. The defense attorney stood, trying to question Jason, but he didn't waver. He had nothing left to prove. The truth was undeniable. The courtroom was filled with an almost palpable tension. The stakes had never been higher for Jason Taylor. He had gone from being the silent observer of a system that had wronged his brother Malcolm to becoming the voice that would expose corruption and demand justice. As the trial entered its final day, he knew the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about his case anymore. This was about sending a message that no one was above the law. Jason sat silently at the prosecution table, his lawyer Mark Lawson beside him, watching the proceedings unfold. The defense had done their best to discredit him, trying to paint him as the villain in his own story. But despite their efforts, the truth had been laid bare. The footage, the testimonies, and his own account of the events painted a clear picture. Blake and Turner had abused their power. They had planted evidence and framed an innocent man. Blake and Turner sat at the defense table, their faces tight with frustration. Their attorney, a slick, experienced man, was still trying to spin their narrative, but Jason could see it in their eyes. The uncertainty, the realization that the walls were closing in. For the first time in the trial, their arrogance had been replaced with something else: fear. The judge, a stern woman with a no-nonsense attitude, called the court to order. The final day of the trial had arrived, and the air in the courtroom felt thick with anticipation. The gallery was packed with spectators, reporters, and members of the community who had been following the case. Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility weighing on him. This wasn't just about his own fight for justice. It was about every person who had been wronged by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Sarah Collins, the district attorney, stood up to deliver the prosecution's closing argument. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "Today we are here to seek justice for Mr. Jason Taylor, a man who was unlawfully detained, threatened, and framed by two officers who were sworn to protect him." She paused, letting her words sink in. Officers Blake and Turner thought they could use their badges as shields, but today, that shield has been shattered. Jason's heart raced as Sarah continued, her words resonating deeply within him. "The footage that was shown to you in this courtroom is not an isolated incident. It is part of a larger pattern of misconduct, one that has gone on for far too long. These officers didn't just break the law, they abused their authority to destroy an innocent man's life." Jason sat up a little straighter, his eyes focused on Sarah as she spoke. This wasn't just about exposing Blake and Turner for the crimes they had committed against him. This was about holding the entire system accountable. This was about making sure no one else would suffer the way he and his brother had. "These officers," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength, "have abused their position of power to manipulate the system and protect their own interests. They planted evidence in Mr. Taylor's car, they threatened him with violence, and they tried to cover up their crimes. But they couldn't hide the truth. The cameras in Mr. Taylor's car caught everything, every lie, every threat, every moment of their abuse. And now, the truth is out." Jason's mind flashed back to that fateful day when he had been pulled over. He remembered the way Blake had leaned in, the smug look on his face as he planted the drugs in Jason's car, the taunts, the threats. It had been a moment of terror, but also a moment of clarity. He knew then that he had to fight, not just for himself, but for Malcolm, for everyone who had ever been wronged by corrupt officers like Blake and Turner. Sarah paused and turned to face the jury. "You, the jury, have the power to ensure that these officers are held accountable for their actions. You have the power to make sure that this kind of behavior is never allowed to continue. This isn't just about one man. This is about making sure our justice system works for everyone, and it starts with you." The courtroom was silent as Sarah finished her closing statement. The weight of her words hung in the air. Jason could feel the eyes of the jury on him. They had seen the evidence. They had heard his testimony. They had heard from witnesses. They knew what had happened. Now it was up to them to make sure that Blake and Turner would pay for what they had done. The defense attorney stood, his movements smooth and practiced, but Jason could see the unease beneath the surface. He knew that this was his last attempt to salvage the case for his clients, but it felt like a desperate plea for mercy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense lawyer began, his voice a little too smooth. "You've heard the testimony, but I urge you to consider the context. Mr. Taylor is no angel. He has a history. He's been involved in questionable activities. He's a man who has been accused of crimes before, and just because he's got a camera in his car and a lawyer doesn't mean he's telling you the truth." Jason's jaw clenched as the defense lawyer tried to twist the narrative. It didn't matter what Jason's past was. What mattered was what had happened on that day. What mattered was the abuse of power. What mattered was that Blake and Turner had broken the law, and they had tried to cover it up. He wants you to believe that these two officers, with years of service and countless arrests, would suddenly turn on him and plant evidence, the defense lawyer continued. But the truth is, there's no evidence of any wrongdoing on their part. We have to question Mr. Taylor's story. We have to question the validity of the footage. We have to ask ourselves, why would two upstanding officers ruin their careers for this? Jason could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he kept his face neutral. He had already given his statement. The footage spoke for itself. The jury knew the truth. Blake and Turner weren't the victims here, they were the criminals. As the defense finished, the judge called for a brief recess. The jury would deliberate on the case and return in the morning with their verdict. Jason's stomach twisted with anxiety, but he refused to let it consume him. He had done everything he could. Now it was out of his hands. The courtroom doors closed behind him as Jason walked out, his lawyer at his side. Mark gave him a reassuring nod, but Jason could feel the weight of the next day pressing down on him. Tomorrow, everything would be decided. The morning of the verdict arrived with an almost unbearable heaviness. Jason had spent the night staring at the ceiling of his hotel room, the events of the past few days playing on a loop in his mind. He had prepared himself for this moment for so long, but now that it was here, he couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. The stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about him. It was about the truth, about justice, and about making sure the system that had failed him and his brother Malcolm would never fail anyone else again. He stood in the courthouse lobby, his hands resting at his sides, trying to keep himself calm. Around him, reporters were setting up their cameras, buzzing with the excitement of the final day. There was a crowd outside, too, people who had been following the case from the start, rallying in support of Jason. They were waiting for the news that would change everything. Jason couldn't help but glance at them, their faces filled with hope, their signs calling for justice. This was bigger than him now. The entire community was behind him. Mark Lawson, his attorney, walked over to him, his usual calm demeanor in place. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a note of concern. Jason nodded, though he didn't feel entirely okay. "I'm ready," he said, though his voice betrayed the uncertainty he was trying to suppress. "But what if they don't get it? What if they don't see the truth?" Mark gave him a reassuring smile. "They've seen everything, Jason. The truth is on your side. You've done everything right. The jury's job now is to do theirs." Jason forced a smile, grateful for Mark's unwavering confidence. It was a little contagious, but it didn't quite erase the tightness in his chest. The door to the courtroom opened, signaling that the jury was ready to deliver its verdict. Jason's heart thudded in his chest as he followed Mark inside. The room filled with the hum of anticipation. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. As Jason took his seat, he could see the faces of the jury members. Some of them looked exhausted, others determined. They had deliberated through the night. They had heard everything. They knew what had happened. It was now a matter of whether they would make the right choice. Jason looked across the room at Blake and Turner. Their faces were a study in contrast. Blake's jaw was clenched, his fists tightly wound, and there was a flicker of panic in his eyes despite the hard exterior he tried to maintain. Turner, on the other hand, looked much smaller now. His shoulders slumped and his gaze kept shifting toward Blake, as if seeking reassurance that never came. He seemed broken, uncertain, a far cry from the confident, arrogant officer who had once been so sure of himself. The judge, a woman with a stern expression, called the court to order. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" One of the jurors, a woman in her late 40s, stood up slowly. The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited. "We have, Your Honor," she said, her voice firm. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." Jason's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The juror turned toward the judge and began to read aloud, her voice steady but filled with the weight of her words. "In the case of the People versus Officers Ryan Blake and Brad Turner, we, the jury, find the defendants guilty of the following charges." The words felt like they were happening in slow motion. Jason's heart beat in his ears as the juror listed the charges: falsifying evidence, planting drugs, violating the rights of a citizen, threatening bodily harm, and misconduct. Each word hit like a hammer, echoing in the room, reaffirming the truth that had been brought to light during the trial, the truth Jason had fought for. As the final guilty charge was read, Jason felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for everyone who had been victimized by corrupt officers, for everyone who had been silenced by the system. It was a win for Malcolm. It was a win for the truth. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Then there was a soft rustle as people began to react. Some whispered to each other. Others wiped their eyes, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. Jason stayed still, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to take in what had just happened. Blake and Turner, however, looked like they had been struck by lightning. They couldn't believe it. Neither of them had expected the jury to return a guilty verdict, but it was over now. The truth had won. The judge addressed the court again. "Officers Blake and Turner, you have been found guilty of the charges brought against you. You will be remanded into custody until sentencing. This court will reconvene in 2 weeks for your sentencing hearing." Blake opened his mouth as if to protest, but the judge silenced him with a stern look. She had already made her decision. The jury had made their decision, and there was nothing left for Blake or Turner to do now but face the consequences. Jason's heart was still racing as the judge dismissed the court. He didn't move at first, too overwhelmed by the weight of what had just happened. His entire body felt like it was vibrating with the rush of relief, anger, and justice. Finally, Mark placed a hand on his shoulder and gave him a small, supportive smile. "You did it, Jason," Mark said, his voice filled with pride. "You made sure they couldn't get away with it." Jason nodded slowly. He didn't know how to respond. All he could do was sit there, his heart still pounding, as the weight of the moment settled on him. It wasn't over yet. The sentencing hearing would come in 2 weeks, and there was still much more to be done. But today was a victory. For him, for his brother, for everyone who had been wronged by the system. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had gathered. People were chanting, holding signs that read "Justice for Malcolm Taylor" and "Hold corrupt cops accountable." Jason stepped out of the building, his heart swelling with pride as the crowd cheered for him. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had fought for this moment, and now the world could see that justice could still be served, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. As Jason stood before the crowd, his hand raised in acknowledgement, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The fight wasn't over, but today, for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe again. His brother's name would be cleared, and maybe, just maybe, the system would finally start to work the way it was supposed to. 2 weeks later, the courthouse was filled again, this time with a different kind of tension. The jury had delivered their verdict, and now it was time for sentencing. Jason sat in the same courtroom where his life had changed forever. The judge, the jury, the defense, and the prosecution were all present. But today, Jason wasn't just a witness or a victim. Today, he was a symbol of justice. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the room. Jason sat next to his lawyer, Mark Lawson, his hands still and steady. The crowd outside had been even larger today, the chants of "Justice for Malcolm" still echoing in his mind. It wasn't just about him anymore. This case had become a rallying cry for people everywhere who had been wronged by a broken system. Blake and Turner sat across the room, their eyes downcast, their posture slumped. The arrogance they had once carried like armor had melted away, replaced by a quiet, almost defeated demeanor. Today, they weren't the ones in control. They weren't the ones who held power. The truth had shattered their lives, and there was no coming back from it. The judge entered the room and everyone stood. She was a woman of few words, but when she spoke, people listened. Her stern face didn't betray any emotion, but the weight of her authority was undeniable. "Officers Blake and Turner," she began, her voice firm and steady, "you have been found guilty of multiple charges, including falsifying evidence, misconduct, and violating the rights of an innocent man. The law is clear, and you both have betrayed the trust placed in you as a public servants." Jason's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Blake's hands trembled slightly, his jaw clenched tight as the judge continued. "For your actions, you will both be sentenced to prison. Officer Ryan Blake, for the role you played in orchestrating the planting of evidence and threatening Mr. Taylor, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison." Jason's heart skipped a beat. It was a long sentence, but it was just. Blake's smirk had faded completely, and his eyes were downcast, unable to meet the judge's gaze. He had no words left, no defenses to hide behind. The weight of his crimes had caught up to him. "Officer Brad Turner," the judge continued, "while your involvement was less direct, you still played a part in this corruption. You followed orders without questioning them, knowing what was right and wrong. For your role in these events, you are sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Turner's face went pale, his shoulders slumping as he heard his fate. He had known the consequences were coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. His eyes filled with regret, but there was nothing he could do to undo the damage. He had been complicit in a system that had betrayed those it was supposed to protect. The courtroom was silent, the gravity of the sentences settling over everyone. Blake and Turner's lives had been destroyed by their own actions, and there was nothing left for them now but to face the consequences of their choices. Jason, however, couldn't bring himself to feel anything but a quiet sense of justice. He didn't feel vindictive. He didn't want revenge. But he knew that this was what had to happen. This was how the system would be forced to change, by holding those who abused their power accountable, by showing the world that corruption would not go unchecked. Later that afternoon, Jason stood outside the courthouse once again, the air warm with the fading light of the day. The crowd was still gathered, their chants growing louder as the news of the sentencing spread. The protesters were there, yes, but so were the supporters. People who had been watching this case unfold. People who had been inspired by Jason's fight for justice. As he walked toward the steps, he caught sight of his mother in the crowd. Her eyes were wet with tears, but the pride in her face was unmistakable. She had stood by him through every dark moment, and now she was standing with him as the truth had finally been heard. Jason walked up to her, his heart swelling as she wrapped her arms around him in a tight embrace. "You did it," she whispered. "You made it right for Malcolm." Jason pulled back slightly and smiled, though his eyes were filled with emotion. "We did it, Mom. It wasn't just me. It was for him, for everyone who's been silenced." His mother nodded, wiping away a tear. "You showed them all that the truth is stronger than their lies." Jason felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. Malcolm was still in prison, but the fight wasn't over. The work had just begun. The system that had let people like Blake and Turner thrive was still broken. But now there was a crack in that system, and Jason knew that crack would grow wider until it couldn't be ignored anymore. The following weeks brought more revelations. Internal affairs began reopening dozens of cases that had been tainted by Blake and Turner's misconduct. The department had no choice but to address the corruption that had festered under their watch. The media storm continued, and the truth Jason had fought so hard for became the catalyst for a movement that extended far beyond his own case. Jason continued to work with Mark and the other advocates who had been helping him. Together, they began pushing for broader reforms in the police department, demanding more oversight, better training, and a commitment to transparency. They worked with victims who had been wronged, helping them find their voice in a system that had tried to silence them. And then, after 2 long years, Malcolm was finally released. Jason stood in the crowded prison lobby, waiting for his brother to walk through the doors. When Malcolm finally stepped into the room, the 2 brothers locked eyes, and without a word, they embraced. The years of pain, the years of separation, seemed to vanish in that moment. Malcolm was free, and together they were going to rebuild the life that had been taken from them. As they walked out of the prison together, Jason felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight wasn't over, but they had won a victory, and that was enough for now. So the story has ended with justice finally being served. Those who abused their power have paid the price, and the truth has finally been revealed. If you find this story interesting and inspiring, don't forget to like and subscribe to follow the next videos. Thank you for watching and sharing stories about justice, fighting for the truth. See you in the upcoming exciting videos.